Okay, well, while we're finishing getting the presentation on the screen here, as Ann said, I've been your chapter project manager for just under 3 months now. And as Ann also reported, I am indeed super excited and passionate about this role. I got an embarrassing amount of real estate in the last Hummin newsletter, so I'm not going to recount a full bio here, but just at the 50,000 foot level. I was born and raised in San Diego. Went to school at UC Santa Barbara, go Gauchos, where I got my degree in biology. This type of work is what I always wanted to do when I went to school and graduated. That's the reason why I got a degree in biology. But various necessities and practicalities of life guided me into the pharmaceutical industry, where I spent a couple of decades developing human therapeutics. But fortunately, due to some business restructuring, et cetera, at the beginning of this year, I found myself available to rediscover my initial passion. So that's how, long story short, I ended up here. Well, actually, I physically ended up here because I married my elementary school sweetheart, and she was living up here in Torrance. So that's how I got from San Diego to Torrance. So despite a promise of a brief bio, that was a little longer than I expected. But thanks all for coming both in person and joining us online. Today, we're going to probably retell the story for most of you of the Palos Verdes blue butterfly. I know it'll be repetitious for some, but hopefully for others, there'll be some new information. But it's important that we're all kind of starting off with the same level of information as we move then into talking about our ongoing project, preservation project. Okay, let's see. Bear with me, just trying to find the forward arrow.
Oh, just down there or something like that.
Ah, thank you, Ann. All right, so in terms of kind of a roadmap for tonight's presentation, again, a quick level set to get everyone oriented or introduced to the Palos Verdes blue butterfly, and then a brief history. Hopefully it'll seem brief because it has an interesting history of its origins and road to current status. Plus, we do have the benefit of probably almost a century's worth of subject matter experts in the room who can talk to this if you have detailed questions. Both Jess and Ann have a multi-decades long experience with this organism here in the South Bay. And then lastly, but most importantly, we'll talk about what is our chapter doing specifically to work towards its preservation. So there's a little bit of everything in this presentation for folks, and for those who have a little bit more of a nerdy bent, the bottom of the screen is covered. Julian, are you able to move that menu bar on that computer? Yeah. Or minimize it, or just pull the screen up if possible so we can see the full slide. Okay, well, in an effort to prevent your eyes from glazing over, so in terms of the Palos Verdes blue butterfly, which we'll just refer to as PVB throughout this for sake of ease, where did it come from? Well, it was first described by the gentleman on the left-hand side of the screen there. That's Dr. Perkins and Dr. Emmel. They're both everyone we're going to be talking about in this presentation, whether they're professionally or recreationally a lepidopterist, they're all very passionate about butterflies. So with Dr. Perkins out of UCLA and his colleague, Dr. Emmel, who was doing residency here in LA, they were collecting on the peninsula here blue butterflies in the early to mid 70s. And started making some observations that some of the butterflies they were collecting looked a bit different than subspecies that had already been described. And so at a high level, as shown on the slide here, those differences included attributes of its size and color, which host plant it was using, and habitat in which those plants and it resided, as well as when it was active and flying around during the year. So again, for those biology nerds in the room, the way this works, when you feel like you've identified something new that hasn't been described before, you publish in a peer-reviewed journal, of course, your case for a new species or subspecies in this case. And what's shown in the screen here are what are called type specimens, which you can think of as like a reference specimen or a control standard or something that, you know, says this is what it should look like. And so out of what Perkins and Emmel collected here in PV, I also wanted to give some acknowledgement to Dr. John Garth, also out of USC, like Perkins. He had a collection. He was also a very avid lepidopterist, and he had a collection of butterflies that he had collected in Palos Verdes from the 20s that were being curated at USC, and contributed. It turned out that they also matched this phenotype of the Palos Verdes blue butterfly, and so they were some of those. That collection is referred to also as types for this new subspecies that was being described. So that's kind of the way it started to, it came together initially, is again, folks who enjoyed the passion of butterflies out looking and taking very detailed observations. For those of us that are animal lovers, unfortunately, most of the time those observations come along with, you know, collecting and killing the animal and taking it back to the lab, but that's some of the only ways you can get the minute measurements needed to differentiate them. And for those who remember back to your high school biology class, besides saying Palos Verdes blue butterfly or PVB, you know, every living thing on the planet is classified also with a very unique identifier, so that, you know, you don't run into confusion over such things as, you know, is a puma the same thing as a mountain lion, is the same thing as a cougar. So to make sure you're actually talking about PVB, and this is where Anne or Jess can correct me. I have the taxonomy, the, you know, King Philip came over from Great Spain hierarchy down there on the bottom of the slide, which you can't see all the way down to the subspecies. But the important part is this PVB is categorized or bucketed in the lepidopterans, which is the order of butterflies. And then as you go down the list, you get more specificity. So you're in the family of Lycaenae, which are the blues and others, as you see there. And then you get down to the species level, which is in that blue box you can't see, genus and species, which were, you know, the Glaucopsyche ligdamus, which was first described in 1841, but which there are now, with the addition of the Palos Verdes blue, I think it's up to 16 or 17 subspecies within that genus and species now. So that's where the butterfly came from, where it lives in terms of our, you know, taxonomical characterizations or categorizations, and we'll start to move into some more macro stuff on the next slide. So where the rubber meets the road in terms of, you know, why is PVB different than previously described blue butterflies in this genus and species? What's shown here is a scan of the black and white photo that was included in the original article by Perkins and Emmel. So unfortunately, we're talking about the 70s, so it's not a, you know, a high res color image, but we'll take it on trust that the journal is peer reviewed and the specimens analyzed and verified. But to orient you to the figure, we've got 3 subspecies moving from left to right labeled across the top there: Australis, Palos Verdesensis, which is our PVB of interest, and then Incognitus, I assume. And what differentiated the middle column, males on tops and females on the bottom, are some key attributes that are listed there on the right-hand side in terms of size and you can, pretty much by eye, you can kind of see when they're all lined up that the PVB in the middle is a little bigger than the Australis and a little smaller than Incognitus. But then if you were to actually be able to, view the specimen in real life, you would notice, differences in coloration, not only with the blue, but with the margins in black along the outside of the wings, as well as the, the intricate spot patterning on the undersides or the ventral sides of the butterflies. So those are obvious visual differences. Another way that butterflies are ID'd in the field is by what plants they visit and rely on for their life cycle. And with PVB, there's two very specific plants which it requires to survive and reproduce future generations. It can be either one depending on the locale where the population is. But on the left, you have Santa Barbara milk vetch, which you may recognize. It has those, it forms those pods. And then what is probably my favorite sage scrub plant, the deerweed on the right, which when that's blooming, it's pretty spectacular if you like popcorn and sunsets, because it has, really beautiful yellow and orange hued flowers. Both of these are native plants to our coastal sage scrub communities. They're perennial herbs, and the blooming periods are shown down there, both relatively early in the year towards middle of the year. And that was another differentiating factor for PVB versus the other known subspecies is, as shown in the parentheses at the bottom, there were differences in the usage patterns of those. The figure on the black and white outline figure on the upper right hand side is just to show kind of set up for the next slide. So these, as I mentioned, these two host plants are native to the area and require specific conditions in which to grow and thrive. And what's shown in that diagram of the peninsula on the right is a vegetation survey done in '94 that showed in the gray areas specifically where either one or both of these plants could be found on the peninsula. So you can see it's a relatively small matrix of where these plants can be found when you look at the overall peninsula, and that was in '94. Of I guess, oh, the cursor does show up. That's great. Well, let's see. We'll get into it on the next slide, I think. First, we'll take a little sidestep into, what does a Palos Verdes blue butterfly do with its life? And so what's shown here in this cycle around the deerweed in the middle, which is essentially its world, is at the top, you have the butterfly. And so there we go. You have the adult butterfly. Relatively early in the year, maybe as early as end of January, depending on the weather, into February, and definitely by March, you could start seeing the adults emerging and fluttering about. They've got about a week to get their business done, a little less than a week. So the males, they're the brightly colored blue ones. They'll kind of mark out a territory and patrol it. Just kind of roaming around. It's like cruising up and down Main Street looking for females to hook up with. And then the females have a couple days longer than that, because presumably once the male and the females have gotten together and they've mated, the female will go off and lay her eggs in the deerweed flowers, or in the milk vetch, if that's the plant that is nearby. The eggs take about a week to hatch, and in that case, the larvae or caterpillars have a few weeks on the plant itself, consuming the flowers or the pollen or the contents of the pods to move through their development cycle. That takes about a month, and so now you can see we've used up the majority of the life cycle, and we've only gone from February through May in the year. So the next step is the caterpillars, when they're ready to do their magical butterfly metamorphosis thing, they'll move down from the flowers and stems of the plant into the litter down below it, the leaf litter. and pupate, which is, when they form their pupa and do the metamorphosis thing, that'll have them emerge as adult butterflies at the beginning of the following year. So key things to take away from this are, this cycle only happens once for the species, the subspecies during the year. So it's not like mammals where you could, push out litters, multiple times a year. They've got this brief period in the spring where the adults emerge and can get together and reproduce, the next generation. And again, as we pointed out, it's specific to one of two plants. And then the majority of the time for this organism is spent in, in the litter underneath the plant. The later summer, fall, and early winter are in when it's pupating down below. So those are key attributes towards its conservation we'll need to keep in mind as we move forward. So we talked about the appearance of the organism, what plant it relies on for its survival, and now we talked about its life cycle, and now we'll talk a little bit about habitat. And so the milk vetch and the deerweed that we've been talking about, those are plants that occur in coastal sage scrub communities. Hopefully that's a vegetation system that you're somewhat familiar with. But basically it's characterized here in California along the coast by low drought-tolerant aromatic shrubs, a lot of which you can see out here in the native garden or in the marsh. And what I have shown in the figures down below, which is also a setup for some upcoming information, is on the left-hand side in the red. That's the range along the Southern California coast where, coastal sage scrub communities could occur, and perhaps historically occurred. And on the right, where you see the purple or fuchsia kind of color, that happens to be where we humans like to live as well. And so the purple is showing the urbanization where we basically plowed under this type of habitat and built on top of it things that bring us pleasure. So this is not specific to the butterfly, of course. This is, a challenge we have with, biodiversity and preserving life here in Southern California across the board, with, as mentioned there, by some estimates, up to 90% of this very specific non-replaceable habitat type has been eliminated. All right, so hopefully you've kind of seen the precarious situation that this butterfly is in as we've kind of talked along. It's got specific host plants, which only occur in specific areas. It's got this peculiar, or let's say unique life cycle where it, can only, it's a single brood, it can only reproduce one time a year. So that's a lot of things that kind of need to line up and work out for the success of this organism. And what's shown in the diagram there below, also an outline of the PV Peninsula, is a figure showing work done by Jess here in the room, where in the early 80s, he mapped out where the PVB was known to exist at the time, in that blue oval there. And you can see that it's if you just look kind of at the gray patches, it's really kind of three different areas. Up in the upper part of the blue oval, you've got Agua Amarga Canyon and where Fred Hess Park is now. In the middle, that big gray area is the landslide area, and I believe towards the top part of that is where Alta Vista is. And then down at the very bottom, the smallest little patch there is, if you go all the way down to the southern end of Palos Verdes Drive East, and you get to go up those fun little switchbacks, that's those switchbacks there, shown there. So again, it's a limited distribution of the plants which are required. It's fragmented. They can't visit each other or escape from one area to another. And in 1980, the case was made to U.S. Fish and Wildlife that, heck, this butterfly it exists, and it's very threatened with going extinct forever. And so that was part of the work that Jess was doing, was to track and figure out where it is living, as well as its host plants. And Jess also got pictures of the last 3 PVBs that were known to exist before they went extinct. So this is in 83, I believe, that yeah, it's on the slide there, 83, where it was presumed that this butterfly was no more and that it was gone, primarily driven by loss of its habitat. Once an animal is listed with Fish and Wildlife and given protections under the Endangered Species Act, theoretically, it's to protect the organism, so it can't be taken or killed by people. It's to protect its habitat. And in this case, there's some pretty sad stories of habitat getting bulldozed under. So that's why that act is important, because even though it exists, it isn't guaranteed that it's going to be the end all. There needs to be some actions to, as Anne was talking about earlier, and the Audubon curve, to bend the curve and bring the population back a different way. So now what we do is, that was 83, and we fast forward 10 years, which sounds like a long time to me, and it must have felt like a long time or a lifetime to people like Jess and Ann in the room here who are familiar with this situation. But a professor out of UCLA, Rudy Mattoni, who I know folks in this room knew well, he was doing some unrelated field work collecting organisms in the DFSP, which is the Defense Field Support Point out in San Pedro, when he, being a passionate lepidopterist, came across a PVB colony. And that was completely unexpected, because as you noticed in the previous slides, we've really been focusing on habitat along the southern end of the peninsula there. Just a quick aside for those who have spent a long time in the area, which I haven't, you're probably familiar with how big of a naval hub the harbors of Los Angeles and Long Beach were back in the day, even from the beginning of the 1900s. But this Defense Fuel Support Point was opened in 1943 during World War II, and its objective or job or function was to store and distribute fuels, to our military services as needed. And you can see why that location was chosen for storage tanks, because it's close to the harbor there. So there were, lines running to the harbor for the distribution of fuel to ships, et cetera. So the reason why to even bring that up is you can imagine, we've all heard stories of what goes on large military bases, and especially ones storing hazardous materials. There were a lot of spills. After the war, as you guys probably are aware, there was lots of excess equipment that we really didn't have the budget to maintain and keep. So a lot of it was broken up and buried in ravines and canyons, et cetera, on that plot of land. And so if we go back to I believe it was the 90s, when we had the BRAC, the Base Closures Act. Can't remember what the full acronym stood for, but you remember we were downsizing our military during that age, and at that point, the DFSP was deemed excess, and fortunately, the Fed did the right thing and had logistics come in and try to remediate the site. So again, for those of you who have been in the area for a long time, you've probably occasionally seen the stories of them, filling the underground storage tanks with foamcrete and dismantling or filling pipelines and dismantling tanks and pipelines above ground, and in general trying to remediate the area. So the good thing about that is it's preserved a lot of that as open space and gave the opportunity in '94 for the butterfly to be discovered. And so, Jess, being the local butterfly hero he was in there immediately, of course, performing surveys, and I believe a survey has been performed every year since '94 in that area to monitor the population. And back in those days, it was estimated that there's, somewhere around 300 individuals living in that area, but it, fluctuates up and down fairly significantly each year, depending on conditions. Let's see, what else is important to point out on this slide? I think our chapter Yes program, our youth environmental stewards have played a role in restoring habitat in this DFSP land. There is a integrated natural resources management plan that INRMP referred to there that describes how the land should be managed and specifically for the biodiversity that is or potentially could be found there.
Well, it's still the one who's print.
We're not there yet.
I don't know the yes program ever got to DFSP.
Okay. Did Yes work at DFSP at all? Okay.
I came much later.
Okay, yeah. So we've had some participation in the remediation and habitat restoration over in this area. But as Anne scooted me along, the money message we're looking for here is that as part of these base relocations and closures, besides remediating land, the military was also looking to offload some land. And so there were a number of organizations that benefited from us. But what's shown here on this slide is if you look at the satellite photo down in the middle bottom, there's kind of a upside down triangle towards the top of that blue border drawn that separates a chunk of land, and that's what's shown in closer detail here. And what that chunk of land is, we talked about storing of fuel and other materials. What that chunk of land was, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, was naval housing for the folks who were working in Long Beach and as well as the DFSP.
So this is on Western, right? Is that on Western?
Yeah, so on this slide here, down kind of where that blue line is running down the right-hand side of that satellite image, that's Gaffey. And then on the right-hand side going down is Western. And then Palos Verdes Drive North is moving across the top of the blue line there. So there's multiple areas that were naval housing. This is just one of them. But why this is important to us is that, as Anne mentioned, around this time, in the early 2000s, Rolling Hills Preparatory School was looking for land to move to where they could expand and build out their facilities. And what's shown in red in the satellite image on the left is the land that they received from the Navy. It was a public benefit conservance, I believe, was the military program or the government program it transferred under. But the idea is that Rolling Hills Prep, RHP, we get the land in red to build their campus and future expansions. And then two other organizations would benefit from the land in green and goldenrod there. But what's in blue is land that Rolling Hills would receive, but would commit to maintaining as butterfly habitat, BVB habitat. And in my mind, and I think many in the room, and the reason why it's one of our chapter projects is, this land I think is quite valuable for, it may not be expansive in terms of acreage, but has a high value footprint for the PVB. And why do we think that? Well, I had mentioned the management plan for the larger base, the DFSP, and that's shown in that colored diagram on the left-hand side there. And if you follow the yellow portions of that map, that's the area that is specifically being managed for Palos Verdes blue butterfly by essentially the Navy's the owner, but by the people that are operating the land for them. And you'll see that butts right up and wraps around that upper triangle we were just talking about, where Rolling Hills Prep got some land. And then it's a little more difficult to see on the right, but in 2012, In the 2012 survey, where that area was monitored for Palos Verdes blue, if you can see the blue dots on the screen, that's where the butterfly was observed. And if you can't see the blue dots in the screen, it's essentially there's a U shape wrapping around that housing development.
Walk over and point.
Well, I guess the people on the screen could see. Oh, and I've got this too. But it's difficult to see even in person. But here's the plot of land that Rolling Hills Rolling Hills Prep has built their campus on, and that habitat area we talked about is right through here. And so, you know, we know that sorry. And just to make it more confusing, the green star on the satellite image, that's where Rudy Matoni and team rediscovered the Palos Verdes blue on the DFSP. So for those reasons, I'd bet $20 of my own money that that's potentially good habitat for the PVB based on previous observations and proximity to other areas where they've been observed. So to talk a little further about the importance of that small but valuable piece of land. So as part of being an endangered species, the Fish and Wildlife Service every 5 years kind of does a review of the current state of the PVB. And the most recent one was in 2021. And at that time, the butterfly was only being observed in 3 locations. And again, we're with blue dots. So if you look at the satellite image, what you can see in kind of the upper middle is some blue dots around Chandler Preserve, where they've been reintroduced multiple times. And then we go back over to the east side of the map, and we're in Upper San Pedro, and you can see the DFSP as well as the Rolling Hills Prep Schools habitat. So as of 2021, and I'm not sure what the most recent data is, but as of 2021, at least, those were the only 3, really 2, if you think about it, spots on the peninsula where the butterfly was still known to exist. The various other colors shown on this map are represent either places where the butterfly has been reintroduced, but didn't take, or it had been observed previously, but no longer is observed there. So all of our eggs have really gotten into a small basket, as you can see. So kind of the typical Fish and Wildlife recommendations based, the outcome of their 5-year review is, heck, let's keep, restoring habitat for the butterfly to survive and up their numbers. Let's continue doing captive rearing, which we're not going to talk about in this presentation today. And let's, keep a close eye on this by doing annual surveys of where their host plants exist. And let's do something to try to connect habitats so that these individual small populations aren't so fragmented across the peninsula where, some natural event could wipe, a whole population out. Okay, so now we're finally getting to where the rubber meets the road, and I thank you guys for your patience. But I think it was important to hear, at least at a high level, the story. Again, talk to Ann or Jess if you are enthralled by that and you want to learn, even more. But where we are today is that we're 10 years out of an agreement with the Rolling Hills Prep School, a stewardship agreement where we agreed to provide them, kind of technical consulting or the subject matter expertise for how to manage this habitat that they've inherited. What needs to be done to maintain that habitat? Yeah.
Easier than pointers and stuff.
Yeah, for the folks online, Ann pointed to the kind of large chunk of green in the upper middle is an athletic field. So what does that look like, managing the habitat for the PVB? Well, fortunately, as part of this agreement to get this land and manage the habitat for the butterfly, a conservation plan was put in place that was approved by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so it's very descriptive of what needs to happen to promote abundance of Palos Verdes blue butterfly and restore and preserve habitat for them. So that's an important document, our habitat conservation plan. Most recent version of that is 2016. And then as with anyone that is managing either an endangered species or their habitats, a lot of times you could accidentally either kill an organism in your activities in managing the habitat, or damage habitat itself. And so you can get a permit under the Endangered Species Act from Fish and Wildlife Service that has some constraints. It says, okay, we're not going to come and arrest you if you kill a Palos Verdes blue butterfly, but what you agree to do is operate within these boundaries or confines to try to minimize the loss of the butterfly and its habitat. So that's an important aspect to this, and why it's important to follow the habitat conservation plan, because it's very descriptive in how to minimize disturbance while promoting the conditions necessary. And I'm sure probably a few of you wonder why we spend so much time focusing on butterflies when we're an Audubon chapter. And I know there's lots of reasons for that, but we don't need to think that way, because as we talked about, the coastal sage scrub communities in Southern California are just about all but gone, and so many species rely on that habitat and rely on each other. And so, just as one example, the endangered coastal California gnatcatcher also happens to be present in the DFSP and adjacent to this habitat. So, you're kind of getting multiple benefits through this habitat restoration, even though it's geared towards the butterfly. Yeah. Okay, so to just kind of peel away another layer of the onion of, well, what does that look like when our chapter says we're gonna, support, from a subject matter expertise aspect and project management aspect, Rolling Hills and their habitat restoration. Well, the key thing here is, as we mentioned under on the previous slide under the permit, is we want to do as little damage as possible while we're trying to restore the habitat and manage it. And one thing that wasn't really at top of my mind when I started reading through all the documentation associated with this is that, most vegetation communities, they aren't static. There certain species, come on following a disturbance and persist for a few years, and then other species come and overtake them. So part of this seems a little counterintuitive. Part of managing this habitat is going to be to disturb areas, because the deerweed is an early succession plant. So it's one that once, a fire rolls through or some other disturbance happens and there's bare ground, it's one of the first plants to move in and as part of the sage scrub community and start growing. So that's why we have active habitat management. But there's really there's 5 goals, and at a high level, the first goal is let's maximize places for the deerweed host plant to grow. And so let's get the things out of there that don't belong. There's trees in that habitat right now that aren't part of the coastal sage scrub community. There's non-native invasive plants like statice and ice plant that need to be removed. And plus, like I just mentioned, we need to disturb some area to make it newly available for deerweed. And once we've done that, then we move more into managing, which is removing non-native plants that haven't been removed already, additional ones, or that appear over time, and then preventing the spread of mature coastal sage scrub. And those are the types of plants that would overgrow the deerweed. They're natives and they belong in a coastal sage scrub community. But if you don't introduce some removal or disturbance of your own, they'll take over and overgrow the whole habitat. So that's part of the management also. Goal number 3 is to keep an eye on things. So every 3 years, do a formal survey where you're actually cataloging the host plant and the butterflies that are observed. Number 4 is more of what we were talking about in terms of unintended disturbances, people driving through there in their dune buggies or partying and leaving beer cans. So that's more about making sure the area is properly controlled and fenced, and that, it's specifically that it's draining, it has good drainage so that it doesn't make it easy for non-native plants to repopulate the area. Because you remember our coastal sage scrub is drought tolerant. And then perhaps most boring, but probably, second most important is just maintaining good communication with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They are aware of this piece of land, and they're aware of the Palos Verdes blue butterfly. It's the Fish and Wildlife Office in Oceanside, San Diego, and Oceanside, San Diego County. And they're up here anyway for other things. Jess was just at a release event at the DFSP a few weeks or maybe a month back. And Fish and Wildlife was there. So they're active with on the peninsula for both the butterfly as well as other things. So it's good to show that, even though we may be much smaller than Palos Verdes Peninsula PVPLC land conservation, that we're also mighty and living up to our responsibilities and helping Rolling Hills to maintain this habitat. And so there's a couple of administrative duties there of submitting reports of, annual reports of what's been done, and annual plans of what you intend to do. So lastly, one project management type slide, which, is a high level work plan that essentially could be the workflow every year. To orient you, across the maroon and blue bar are the months of the year. We're about, a little over halfway through the year. So today is March here, middle of July. And, one of the challenges is that mentioned here in the box is that, we need to work around the PVB flight season, because we don't want to interrupt their very short window to get together and reproduce. But the other thing we have too is a problem with the humans, which is, you've got the flight season in the spring, and then I'm going to let Jess or Ann answer that one once I get finished my long-winded point here. But then the school is out for the summer too, so you kind of lose your elbow grease for being able to get things done in the preserve. And then, as I just mentioned, you've got reporting and planning to do, which are the smaller rectangles kind of waterfalling down the right-hand side of that timeline there, to communicate to Fish and Wildlife what you've done and what you plan to do. So really what that leaves you with is those 2 green bars as windows of opportunity to actually get some work done in the reserve.
When we first visited Chandler, you know the answer to Paul's question.
Yeah, well, from a micro level, Anne has done a great job as part of my onboarding of introducing me to all the reserves on the peninsula. And first time I went to Chandler with Anne, and we talked hypothetically about that being Palos Verdes blue habitat. I think, shortly, and within minutes of that, 3, males on patrol kind of went fluttering by. So they do exist at Chandler. I don't know what that looks like from a year to year. Oh, okay.
I haven't been doing the work there. It's a tough butterfly to reintroduce to the water, really tough.
But hopefully with this methodology, if we create the habitat, they will come, right? It's because we know that they're at DFSP, so they're adjacent. We just need to invite them in. A couple of nuances I wanted to point out, besides, scheduling of the work, is one of the challenges is that over the 10 years that this agreement has been in place with Rolling Hills Prep, there's been quite a bit of turnover of faculty and staff. So you kind of have to rebuild the wheel, with new head of school, new administrators, new teachers. Because as you saw, this was a lot of information to really kind of understand what the organism is and what it needs. And so, having to, if we want their buy-in, and investment in this, they need to have all this understanding too.
I don't think COVID helped at all. Nobody was there.
And then there's one additional little nuance that I just want to point out, because most people would probably tell me just to forget about it, but it's really been eating at the back of my brain, is as I mentioned, this whole area has been a military dumping ground of various chemicals and materials for decades. And there was, I believe, fuel disposal on this property for a period of time right in this area here. And rather than actually remediate the soil, what was done was an engineered soil cap was put over. So you can Google that and look what that is. But essentially it's like, rather than digging all this up, and dealing with it, let's just put a cap over the top of it and try to keep people out of it, like it's a grave or something. Yeah. So I don't know what they're disposing of there, but yeah, there was housing all around.
It's like that.
Right.
I can talk.
Which one?
DFSP. I mean, the housing area.
Oops, wait, I'm on it. There.
There we go. Yeah, so I've seen the blues right here. Yes, have you been out here recently at all?
No,
This used to be loaded. And then when they fixed up these houses for housing, they killed all the deerweed, but this had a ton of butterflies in it. This never much anything. And of course, all that school and all that's gone. But along here, both sides of the fence, they gave us in these open areas, they have the butterflies. But so I think it's in pretty good shape. They just need the plants.
Right. Yeah, and when we were out there a couple months ago, it was, there was a lot of black mustard that had overgrown.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a problem.
but all used to the ice plant.
Oh, that's even worse. Okay, so basically, long story short, let me catch back up here where I think we're on the last slide. Yeah, and what are the immediate next steps? Well, we need to put together some friendly educational materials for both faculty and students at Rolling Hills to kind of bring them up to speed on, the butterfly and what it needs and what their responsibilities are for that habitat, that they got for $1. And then meet with them once they're back in session and we can get, folks' ears. I think we should renew our 10-year stewardship agreement, which ran out last year, in some form of documentation, just where we've got codified, roles and responsibilities. And then essentially align the work plan for the remainder of the year and hopefully for the next year so that we can, get a report written and submitted to Fish and Wildlife. We're kind of, I wouldn't say bad standing, but we're in kind of sketchy standing at the moment since annual reports haven't been being submitted. So they'd like to see that we're back and engaged and have a plan or following a plan. So that's what that catch-up incidental take permit reporting is.
3 butterflies there and that brought back something, right? And what's the significance of this?
Yeah, so this little figure of the 3 butterflies on the right-hand side, this is our at the top, our male Palos Verdes blue. And then our in the middle, our female, who's a little less brilliant in appearance, but brilliant in other ways. And then at the bottom is a side view showing the underside of the wing patterning and how cute and fuzzy their bodies are.
In fact, Jess can probably correct, but the females have wide black borders. I don't know why they colored them around here. You know what Jess? The females have black borders. Why is that?
Well, it's extensive brown. On the other wings.
'Cause I only consider them people. That's just big stuff.
So I know I have a tendency probably to dive a little too deep. I find this stuff fascinating. And I'm sure Jess and Ann could both probably tell stories for days, because this was just a very surface
Well,
level.
I think at this point, ask Jess to talk about when they rediscovered it. He has a good story. Jess, your story when that was rediscovered?
Doesn't it? Oh,
He didn't really.
yeah. I worked with Rudy Matoni for. Rudy and I got together in the early '80s to look at the butterflies and do surveys. So our chapter put together the first two real extensive surveys after the work that Emma and Perkins had done. And we discovered several new locations for the butterflies that hadn't been found by the previous investigators. And then the butterflies simply disappeared. But Rudy and I were out quite regularly for several years looking for them across the peninsula and just no luck. And then John Atwood, who'd been doing all the work on the California gnatcatcher and cactus wrens, mentioned that the astragalus was found at DFSP. And so that was a place that really needed to be looked at. And when I knew that Rudy and Rick Rogers and another fellow were doing some surveys, and one afternoon I got this phone call from Rudy. He said, "Guess what I saw today?" And I said, "No, you didn't." And he said, "Oh, yes, I did." And so I went out the next day with Rudy and got photos of the butterfly. And then everybody came out after that. Bruce Peterson came and took photographs, which were the ones that ended up in the LA Times the next weekend. But we published the first photograph and before the Times got theirs out. So we had our scoop.
I think that's a pretty cool bookend story, how you had the last photos before it presumably went extinct, and then the first photos when it was rediscovered.
We did the survey in '83, and there were none of the locations we found the year before, or the historic ones, showed any butterflies. And then I found another small population on one of the hillsides in early March, and that was the end of the butterflies. None were found after that. But this population on the branch of Palos Verdes was strictly on the stragglers. There was no deerweed on the south side of the hill. That was on the north side. So it was the population at DFSP was rather scattered. Most of it, or probably the main population, was above the rifle range, and there was both the stragglers and deerweed there. And then north of that, there was extensive deerweed, and the butterflies were using that as well.
You know, there was a question there, Jess. What do you think they were asking about the minimum size needed to carry a good population of these?
I don't know. I don't think we know enough about biology of the butterfly to really say how much space is needed or how many plants or whatever.
Yeah, I could do a guess with the ultimate group, but you still want to have a really substantial size where genes go to keep them.
Yeah, the more you have, the better, of course. But the flight period for these butterflies that are out there now is later than the flight period for the original RPV population by a couple of months, month and a half. So it is a different population.
And one more question for you here, Jess, in the room.
Yeah, really, kind of I'm guessing a statement, there's probably no overlap, Sedunda and TV.
No, they're two different species altogether.
Yeah. 'Cause the
And
habitat's different.
they feed on different things.
Right. They now far up the coast, way down the coast, either one to go.
So they,
Guess the twain may never meet.
the Elsagon blue are coastal.
Yeah, and they feed on a different plant every time of year. So Palos Verdes blue, sky,
Originally, the population was late January through early March was the RPV population on the south side of the hill. And this population, the rediscovered lives in April. And it's light into May. So I guess now the releases this year or earlier than that. I am not convinced that we really had any breeding population on the peninsula for this new, for the reintroductions. The butterflies that I've seen and I thought were actually reproduction from the peninsula. There's a good likelihood that they were part of a release. The releases went on. I haven't been informed of when they were, so I didn't know what the status of these were. And so the time that you were out of Chandler, I was probably there in a couple of days. You would notice butterflies flying, but it was right after the release.
so
Dispersed pretty quickly.
I do know, Janet Johnson, who's managing the captured population, does reach out on occasion to get new genes, or, different collect from the field. And add it to the population, so there's some gene flow.
Yeah, well, I wonder if they're all from DLSP or like those.
Oh, yeah. We've got questions on the chat. Would you like to handle them?
So first question in the chat, what is the minimum viable? Actually, sorry, first question is, what is the current status of the Chandler Preserve? That was a while ago, but maybe that was answered.
Yeah.
Okay, and then, what is the minimum area for a viable habitat for the PV blue?
And the answer was, we don't know.
I mean, fortunately, as individuals, they're not ranging across acres, right? I mean, if the milk vetch is there and the deerweed is there, that's their world,
They own the same plant.
Yeah.
But they don't move very much. And considering the size of the EFSP, it's that area where they exist and have persisted is maybe 15-20 acres. The northeast side.
Here's a good biology question. Sorry, Prevail, I scooped you because I like the question. Can they live anywhere that deerweed or milk vetch is found, like say in the Santa Monica Mountains?
Well, they do, but not necessarily the Palos Verdes. This is a very common butterfly, the silvery blue, and it's found extensively in the common subspecies in Southern California feeds on deerweed.
Yeah.
And that's found all through the foothills of Southern California. So it's not surprising that these things will feed on deerweed.
But
What that means in terms of them being Palos Verdes blues, I don't know.
yeah. Was that the last question, Prevail?
There's one on chat.
Yeah,
So, yep, I think that was the last one that you just got.
and you know, it's a fairly interesting and kind of crazy turny story overall, but just when you think it couldn't get any crazier, as we showed in the slides, you know, the DFSP was shut down and all the remediation and cleanup was completed in 2017. And then in 2018, the Navy put out a proposal to reopen put out a request for proposals to reopen basically, I think the Navy owns this land. They need to realize some revenue out of it. So they're seeking proposals for companies to come in and restore it to a fuel depot. And of course, the Navy would have first rights of fuel in times of need, but I think they dropped that because they weren't getting proposals. But I think now that they do actually have an active proposal for the DFSP to return it to operation. So presumably that won't affect what's being done from a restoration and preservation standpoint. But I think that, you know, that's something we'll all want to keep an eye on once that's announced. There's been an environmental impact report associated with that and everything. And of course, the finding was no significant impact if all the rules are followed.
So
But
go back to one of your earlier slides where you show where all the fuel lines are, DFSP. It matches with where the butterflies were. It's very good.
yeah, so yeah. But along with lines, you have tanks and people moving around and
My favorite is the 1943 lookout. But all these dots right in here, these are all their fuel lines and stuff. And it's where this stuff is that the butterflies live. In fact, you go up into here and they fly back and forth between the area that's been turned into housing in this area. See, this is a good spot for them because it's larger than all the other pieces, it looks like. Yeah, well, Dad was releasing them there and they were all over there.
That's rodents.
Oh, but not the original.
And the original population.
Now we're here.
Yeah.
And where in here, the stragglers back down here. And this was up here, we was up here, see the main populations are along here. And then up over this coastal ranges.
It's really scary working in this area. Because they do, they're shooting off ammo, real stuff.
Even today?
Well, it's all enclosed, it's an practice place, but there's been casings throughout that area. And when I was doing the surveys, and I haven't been doing it for several years, but right in here, there are like 2,000 deer reflex there. So. Deer plants. We have different areas that I go to and I would count. And Andrew's not here tonight, but you've seen Andrew, and he likes to talk. And so I knew I'd be counting about 2,000. So I go, Andrew, you have to be really quiet. And we would do pretty good. We couldn't mean that we started talking. But he was a good helper. Yeah, a really good helper. He did all the recording for me.
so my only point in mentioning that last item about reopening the fuel supply depot is again, you know, we trust, but this is going to be private industry moving in now. Of course, there'll be a document saying what they can and cannot do, but all these tanks and lines have been filled with you know, material, so they're solid full. So there's gonna be a lot of excavation and other work being done. So it behooves us to get our habitat, you know, up and in good working order so that if a migration needs to happen, there's available space. Bill.
Where on this map is a massive construction of all those condos and homes going in across the street.
Goes it further.
East of, it's Green Hills Cemetery and west of lower left.
Yeah, the old baby house.
You know, all those.
Yeah.
Oh, good, way down there.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
so-
some, yeah, it's been going in for several years now.
Yeah.
South,
Yeah,
southwest.
right in the center is
Oh, it's not putting in, it's done. It's done, it's there. It's houses and condos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Taking up the place where they came to go, they wasn't going.
I think it's worth noting that the military has always been very cooperative in this. When the butterfly was rediscovered, the first thing that we did was go to Colonel Gross, who was running the operation. And he was all in. At Chevron, when Rudy pointed out to the Chevron folks who were doing the sewer or doing the line repair, that these butterflies might be the, Palos Verdes blue and endangered. They stopped work immediately. And then Gross was fairly new on the site, and he knew he would be there for 3 years. And he decided that his interest was really in the natural world there. But he couldn't guarantee anything about the next person who would come in when his tour of duty there was over. So he was really insistent on getting a management plan in place before he left. Because once you have the plan there, the new guy coming in can look at it and say, oh yeah, we already got, I don't have to do anything about that. I've got enough to do without worrying about this.
Yeah.
And then Fish and Wildlife, Mary Beth Wolf, has been fabulous with everything on the peninsula. It's a great combination.
Yeah, so Jess, are they still breeding the Palos Verdes blue butterfly? in
Donna
Moore
is
Park
doing
College?
a fabulous job at Moore Park College. She has thousands of them every year. So there's breeding them in captivity in the laboratory is very successful. Breeding them in the wild is another matter altogether.
So, but they still release them. and people-
They're releasing
Are they
constantly.
releasing
Yes.
at this site or at other sites?
It's at quite a few sites around the peninsula.
Yeah, a couple
Okay,
years
so
ago,
more than just this, okay.
Fish and Wildlife Service said, don't let them die in the lab. Get rid of them, dump them out at places throughout the peninsula. So there's places where they,
Alpha Ascending is a good place. There's some really nice habitat.
yeah.
I had thought this year that I was seeing butterflies that were in fact reproduction on there.
That's what I heard.
I'd seen females laying eggs a year before. On the straggles. I don't consider the deer, personally, I don't consider the deerweed butterflies.
A perfectionist. And yeah, so up at the Sente, and there was a place in the middle of where the landslide is right now that was completely given. So, you know, it's exactly that.
Keith, great presentation.
Thanks, and I know it was long, but I appreciate your patience to share. I think it's important that we recognize as a chapter those, I mean, sure, we have a lot of fun enjoying our passionate birds and stuff, but it's also good to see where we're making an impact, a long-term impact. So.
We had a lot of students out there.